Hi, Emily. Welcome on the Looped In podcast, the retail re-engagement podcast where retailers come on to share with their peers some strategies and tactics on how to really engage our customers in today's challenging macro environments. The aim today is really to unpack how brands can stay close to their customers while scaling across channels, because of course, that's where things become a bit more difficult. So we'll focus on those real tactics and reflections that your peers in customer experience or retail and strategy roles can really digest and learn from, especially as those navigating D2C expansion.
Great.
So
Thank
kicking
you.
this off, do you mind telling us a little bit more about your journey within the space? What were key roles that you've had and what's been the connecting tissue within your career?
Yeah, so I've been in consumer tech, retail, and fashion for just over 15 years. And my career started in consulting, but then since then has really spanned operational roles, strategy, merchandising, marketing, operations, product management. And then I think most recently in the past more like 7 years is when I really started on the path that I think that I'm closer to on now, which is this customer-centric world and how we build experiences, companies, and products that are really centered around delivering what the customer is excited about. I started more in the kind of general management space, and now in my most recent role at Margaux, I'm the Chief Revenue Officer. I came most recently from Reformation, where I was the SVP of Customer. But I would say the connective tissue across all three of them is building a product experience and brand across any of the channels that the company is in, whether it's wholesale, retail, or direct to consumer from an e-comm perspective, and building a connective experience that's really understanding who the customer is and really delivering what's going to drive them to try the brand and then to return.
It's actually so interesting because I feel like your role has grown at the same time as the industry was changing quite a bit, right? In terms of understanding really what is a customer strategy and then expanding onto the impact that that has in terms of commercial, etc. Would you say that that's true and maybe something that's shaped your career?
That's so interesting. I do think that actually is true. And I like to say that I've been super intentional in riding that wave. My brain kind of goes to where I was at Stitch Fix, where the core tenets of the company were just so customer centric. And we leaned so much on data and insights to make decisions. And specifically in my second role at Stitch Fix, where I was in a GM role, we based all of our product evolution work starting with customer insights, and it just oriented me towards that. I do think it's a very like tech centric approach that's not always applied to fashion, but Stitch Fix was so good at combining kind of tech best practices and being a tech centric company, but then also thinking about it through the lens of fashion and e-commerce. And then it's funny you bring it up because I think maybe it was just kismet, but I was introduced to Hallie Borenstein, who's the CEO of Reformation, and she kind of had a vision for how she wanted to evolve what customer centricity meant at Ref and evolving it from being just a we tell you what's cool company, although it still very much is that
It
too,
still
but
knows what's cool, yeah.
totally. But evolving it to bringing more of this really customer centric mindset, understanding who our customer is, what she wants more of, what she wants less of, and how do we build a connected experience that is really centered on the customer and not just centered on the dictating of you're lucky to be here kind of mentality that I think can sometimes exist in fashion that I don't think was true at Ref, but I think the more advanced I think and growing fashion brands are ones who are balancing this broader elevated brand view and delivering excellent product on top of it with a deep understanding of who their customer is. And then it just kind of kept evolving for me and me realizing that this was something that I was really passionate about and that I thought there was really space for. And then I met the co-founders of Margaux and they agreed. And so I went on to my next role to manage a holistic view of revenue, but really having that be centered on the customer.
Which is fascinating, right? Because at the end of the day, the customers are the one that create the revenue. And so your commercial strategy really is a customer strategy at the end of the day. But I think this was not the way that people would have thought about it 10 years ago. A question for you. So is Stitch Fix or was it a tech company for you or was it a retailer?
That was always like the existential question I think that the market was asking too and still is probably. And I think it's both. I don't think there's any reason why it can't and shouldn't be both. Stitch Fix was very ahead of its time and Katrina was very forward thinking in this way. But now especially the world we're entering into, where you have all these new players coming on the landscape that are really AI driven and making personalized shopping recommendations. I don't know if anyone else has really cracked it the way that Stitch Fix has to date. I'm sure someone else will come up and break through the noise. There's a couple that we're looking at partnering with as an example at Margaux, but I don't think it has to be one or the other.
Yeah.
And I think it was truly both. It was fundamentally a like different type of online retail experience, a different type of e-comm that was fundamentally like deeply based in data, tech, innovation. And the company was kind of set up to support both of those
Which is
pillars.
fascinating. That must have been such a great learning opportunity for you, because having, I think, that technical lens on data-driven decision, as you say, that's something that a lot of people in retail don't really have in their toolkit.
Totally. And it can be complicated data and it can be not complicated data. So at different points in my career, I think especially starting in consulting, you learn that one of the most basic things to do is just ask the customer. Sometimes when I'm talking to people now, I just say, like, have you asked them? Have you sent a survey? Have you just asked the question? And in consulting, that's a big part of the value prop, especially in private equity, the PEG group, where you're doing diligences quickly, where you just talk to as many customers as you can in different ways. And that really carried through to Stitch Fix, where we had a really active two-way conversation with our customers in a lot of different ways, but it was kind of fundamentally how the platform was set up. But we weren't afraid of going out and starting with a survey as a starting point to trying to unpack and answer a question. And that was really kind of fundamental for when I was there and as we were figuring out how to evolve the Fix experience. But that simple, paired with also the ability to be really nuanced and complex about how you have a great BI setup at your business, because you can't manage what you can't measure easily. And then the ability to test is really what I learned at Stitch Fix, that I think is, if I could give one piece of advice or communicate one thing, it is set up the infrastructure to support rapid, rigorous testing. Don't be afraid to test. Look at a failure of a test as a good thing, not a bad thing. And everything, I think, can be really iterative if the company is set up to be able to learn from testing.
I mean, that's amazing. That's an amazing advice, but I think it's definitely a consulting and tech world advice, right? The iterative
Maybe,
approach
yeah.
well, because when you think about fashion brands, a lot of time you have to make decisions for your production so much more in advance from being able to interact with your customers about it. So being able to develop framework that is iterative testing is something that's definitely a bit novel, but so amazing.
Iterative testing means different things at different places. And again, you kind of internalize lessons. I've internalized lessons at different points in my career, and then kind of realized what was at the kernel of why the company made that decision and learned a major lesson from that. Similarly, this concept of test and iterate was so core to how Reformation operated. And Reformation was started to have a very short time to market from sketch to being able to sell to customers. And that's then obviously was very core to the sustainability mission, but it allowed them then and now to launch quickly, read quickly, react quickly, create less waste for the customer, for the business. And I took so much from that. Even now at Margaux, we think about that all the time. To a certain extent was something that was already something they were thinking about before I joined, but we've been able to continue to build out the team with some other folks who think like this too. And the idea of what parts of your production timing can you shorten so that you can give that flexibility to get the customer read on something? Because the kind of holy grail in fashion is to show something to a customer, have them vote with their wallets, and then be able to fulfill it for them. If you could do that the next day, that would be everything. But I think that, companies like Reformation taught the industry, but taught me specifically how important it is to have this cadence of test, launch, pre-order strategy, and be able to chase when you see what's working.
Do you remember when there was all those big discussions about see now, buy now, the runway shows, especially with Tommy Hilfiger, and then somehow that never really took off? There's definitely obviously companies looking at shortening the production cycle, but that whole promise of innovation of, okay, now we're going to buy the runway directly. That's such a shame that we were never really able to fulfill those hopes as an industry.
Yeah, it's a good
point. And so in terms of defining customer centricity, would you say that that's really about listening to the customer and taking decisions based on that feedback? Or how would you actually define customer centricity at large for an organization?
The first piece is knowing who your customer is. And so that's the first question. And if you don't know who they are, then the first step is to define it. I've done customer segmentations a lot of different ways at different companies, but the fundamental kind of structure of it is overlaying demographic and qualitative survey-based questions and comparing that against the actual customer behavior that that person had. So looking at their LTV and purchase patterns. And from that, creating distinct segments, and you can see who are your super consumers, who are your kind of once a year consumers, who are the maybe higher potential ones. And I think having a sense for who they are and how they differ from each other is really the starting point. And it sounds basic, but I think it's basic not because it's easy or straightforward, but because it's foundational.
It's foundational, but also you need to operationalize it, right?
So I've done customer segmentations now at the past 3 companies that I've been including. So Margaux, Reformation, and Stitch Fix. And I would say it's been most successful at Margaux so far because we did it so early on, and having this basis of customer personas. There's 2 insights that I have here, because I do think that this came up every time before, which is you have this, it's lovely to look at, everyone thinks it's interesting, and then no one does anything about it.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's 2 ways to combat that, right? The first thing is, and this is kind of my favorite saying in general, is it's not that nice of a saying, but is the fish stinks at the head. So the CEO or whoever the head of the business is has to be all in on this customer persona and segmentation. And they have to be really willing to internalize it, live it, action it, because if that person isn't all in, it won't trickle down to the rest of the org. So I think that that's a really foundational insight that I had. But the earlier you can do it, the better, because it's really hard to retrofit learnings to a segmentation or a persona exercise versus knowing it and being able to build from it. For a more mature company, I think you can still potentially action that by using a reset moment, but you do have to really be willing to talk about the customers, name them, talk about them all day long as you're making product decisions. Who is this for? As you're choosing creators and influencers, who are they speaking to? It's less about like only speaking to one person, but I think it's about understanding who they are and creating like a connected experience for them. So we have a sense for what her favorite type of shoe is. We have a sense for like where we find her and how she likes to shop. And does she shop for vacations versus does she shop once a year when she's doing a big wardrobe refresh? And having that understanding and being able to tailor messaging. It's not a science, but it can be scientific in its application if you are thoughtful and just willing to do it. Because if you get to a point where you're like pitching it to the marketing team and they're like, yeah, great, but like we're not going to change anything about our targeting strategy, then it's not really going to go anywhere.
That's my favorite area of this, because I always think that there's also a big problem with people mixing up what their ideal persona is versus their actual persona.
Totally.
And really having a business that lies to themselves and has a lot of wishful thinking. And then the other problem that we've had at Farfetch was that we had different personas for different parts of the organizations.
I've seen that happen before too. Yeah.
So, which makes it very difficult because marketing and commercial have to be aligned, because then how are you able to like pitch your retail marketing if you're not actually able to activate those audiences in a way that is measurable?
Totally. It's such a good point, because I've seen that many times before. And I do think that that would be kind of like number one symptom that this isn't going to work, is if there are different personas across the business. The core thing is that you understand who makes up your customer base. It's never one person who's in your customer base.
Yeah.
I've generally found there's somewhere between like 5 and 7 core personas. Your customer is telling you who they are. And then you have this other customer who's kind of on the edge, who you want more of. And it's a tension of, how do we continue serving the core customer while expanding into this other customer? And I think it's possible to do. It's just, you need to be intentional. You need to not try to serve too many. And it helps when there's kind of symbiosis between those 2 customers and they're not these like 2 polar different types of people.
You can't have a customer base that's buying your joggers and you're hoping to be Celine, you know? My tactical question on this though is, how often do you redo this work? Because your customer base is evolving all the time. Do you have the risk of leaving them behind and staying on a frozen state of things, but actually they've evolved?
So that's a great question. Before Margaux, the past 2 customer segmentations that I had been a part of were kind of major data exercises.
You can't do this every day, just in terms of mobilizing the organization and the cost and all of this.
Totally. So there's no way we could have redone that every year. It would have introduced too much churn to the business. I will say what's been really cool about what we've done at Margaux is we did a persona exercise right when I started. And Margaux's so much smaller than the other companies, which I do think actually is an important insight of just how do you stay nimble and agile, and you are able to move more quickly when you have fewer people that you have to align and communicate to. But we have a great performance marketing agency that's actually a very strategic partner, and they're the ones who led the exercise for us. They're really close to the business still, so we didn't have to like train them on who we are, but we were able to go about our day-to-day lives while they were doing the persona exercise. It wasn't overly wrought in terms of statistical clustering the same way that some of my others have been in the past, but it still was really accurate. And I think we're going to refresh it this fall. So it's an interesting thing that you brought up, because we do want to have a pulse on how the customer is changing. But my instinct and I guess hope would be that we don't get this new set of 5 personas, but rather we get an update on have we made progress on the 2 that we were kind of hoping to make progress on, have either evolved, and what can we learn about the way they've engaged on their customer journey since we last checked. And some of the same customers might answer, some different ones might answer, and that's totally okay. But I'm excited to see like what a refresh of the work does, especially with a brand that's evolving. I think it is important to make sure that you're not just letting it sit stagnant, because that's where it just, again, the whole point is like, don't let your customer or concept of your customer get stale, because the customer is not stale.
They're evolving how they shop, they're evolving their expectations. And in terms of that actual customer feedback, so with the customers that you have, obviously understanding them, being clear on who they are, how do you actually capture their feedback on a day-to-day basis? How you close to that voice of the customer? And is there an omnichannel approach to that?
Totally. The first starting point is kind of like know who your customer is. The second part of it, I think, is actually a lot easier to action for any size or stage organization, but still requires this like cultural. And again, I think that if it comes from the CEO, that's how it's successful. And I think to both Hallie and Katrina and how much they championed the voice of the customer, and that's why it worked. And the co-founders at Margaux are super customer-centric. What that looks like really tactically is having as many touch points for customer feedback in the day-to-day experience as possible. So the very basic set of it would be, I'm a big believer in NPS. It can be a little controversial. Some people would say it's outdated, but I still think it's a metric that you can measure and pulse up and down, understand what's happening. And the secret about NPS is you get so much open-ended feedback on NPS surveys. So NPS returns data is probably the most valuable place to get data. And from a lesson at Stitch Fix early on, which we then implemented at Ref2, is forcing the customer to give you some sort of feedback on returns, even if they, just put a period in the open text spot. But I think making sure that you're encouraging them to give you real feedback. So returns data, NPS, and then customer service tickets. The kind of like fourth one, I guess, within there is CSAT. So the customer satisfaction survey that you send after the ticket. And CSAT is also a real pulse on not just how your customer experience team is doing and serving customers, but it tends to serve as a pulse for the overall mood of the customer also. And so having all of those set up to run all the time, that they're really easy to measure and track, and that you have some sort of system that's collating the insights from across all of them and translating it into a true kind of voice of the customer representation. At Margaux, we're on Shopify, and I think Shopify makes this actually very easy. And now there's an additional layer of AI tools that are making it even easier to tie this kind of more open-ended data from multiple sources. But at Ref, we implemented all of these different surveys, and we had an amazing, more larger scale, slightly more enterprise level solution that sat over all of these open-ended responses, tied it back to purchase data, and allowed us to trend out what was customer sentiment on a product level, on a channel level. And you just need that daily, weekly visibility into what the actual customer is telling you to know how you're doing and to make real changes. So I think that's the biggest mistake that you could make, is not having these ingestion points set up. And then the second piece of it is not regularly reviewing them and listening. You don't have to be an ex-consultant to know what the customer is saying when you have these data sources. Like, they're telling you what's wrong. Sometimes it's easy to fix and sometimes it's not, but it's largely like a lot of core experience, which is what is the first order kind of Maslow's hierarchy. The basic set of customer needs have to be met before they can go up the chain and realize the kind of like self-realization of an amazing brand experience.
Do they tell you about opportunities as well?
Sometimes I think surveys are generally the best place when you say, like, what do you want to see more of? What could we do better? I think that that's where, in my mind, retail comes in, where the additional layer of customer feedback that's really the richest and is the true front line are customer experience associates and the people who are actually handling the tickets at both Margaux and Ref. My kind of superstars were the people who ran my customer experience teams and then the teams themselves. They are just the most important brand ambassadors that you can have. It's the most crucial to creating retentive experiences. And both of those, they were both women in these cases, but were just had the best instinct about our customers. And I think if you sleep on those leaders within the organization and those functions, it's a really big mistake, especially in how AI is evolving. Like, use AI, supplement it. We have a great AI agent that we're loving, right? But at the end of the day, you still train everyone the same way, which is to be customer first. And nothing, I think, in my opinion, will really change that core customer interaction that you have with a human. And then retail is where you get amazing feedback. I think the challenge with retail, which I know you know very well, that we're excited about kind of trying to unlock, is that retail feedback can feel very anecdotal. And so it's translating anecdotal retail feedback into something that is really as based in data as possible. But still, the store managers will always be the first place I go to at any company to say, what's going on? What is our customer like? What do they not like? And they have their pulse on everything.
And organizationally, so you mentioned those two key sources, which is the customer experience leaders managing your service associate teams, experience associate teams, and then the retail leaders managing the sales associates in stores. How do we organizationally ensure that the insights that are captured feed into marketing? Might it be growth performance marketing, or might it be also community marketing at large? And then separately production, thinking about where do we go next as a company as we continue to expand not only our channels, but also our categories of product, our categories of services. How do we link those different parts of the organization?
I think it's partly cultural, which is where I come back to. If you have a CEO who is championing the voice of the customer across the org and making it a priority, it will be a priority. That is really what I saw modeled by Hallie at Ref. So that is the first piece. I can't emphasize that enough, that the CEO has to champion it. I feel that really strongly, and then support it. The second piece is kind of the more tactical side, which at a smaller company, it's easier, but it is making time and space in the weekly performance meeting to talk about customer feedback, having the retail leaders on that call, having kind of just open space where if I'm talking about how performance marketing is going, we're also hearing from retail about what they're seeing and hearing in the stores. We have equal airtime for the customer experience team to tell us what's popping up. Like, it's really basic, but just making sure that all parts of the organization have that space and in whatever kind of that company or like leader level setting is to share.
When you say it, you make it sound obvious, but I don't think that's really how it works everywhere.
Sometimes coming back to the basics in this type of topic, which is creating the platform, making sure that everyone knows that the platform is supported. And then there is an element, even as I'm saying this out loud, it's just like the type of people you hire, which is that there is a little bit of something that I do try to gauge for from a hiring perspective, regardless of what I'm hiring for, is just like, are they a fundamentally curious person? And curiosity generally translates to customer centricity if someone's interested in joining a fashion brand. It doesn't always, but I think that it's pretty correlated. I want to take in a bunch of information, which is just more how my brain works, right? So I think it's also good to surround yourself with people whose brains work differently, but take in all the information and kind of look at it together and then be able to come up with an answer or a set of possible answers. And I think like a tactical way to do it for a larger company is implementing structured voice of customer meeting, which we did, I think, with a lot of success at Ref, where depending on how big the business is and how often it changes, it could be monthly or quarterly, but having a recap with all of the decision makers in the room who can actually make changes and calling out the key themes that you're hearing from across all of these touch points, whether they're data driven or more qualitative across the org. And that's where you can say, hey, X fabric is bothering customers, like PD, is there something that we can do about it to make that fabric softer for the first time the customer is receiving it? It really can feel like pretty tactical from that perspective. Or we're getting, a ton of increased complaints recently about our returns experience, like product management. What can we do to evolve that? Let's put that on the roadmap. And I think as long as you're surfacing it and you have alignment at an executive level that it matters and you're not letting it fall to the bottom of the priority list, then that's how you get it done.
It must be a bit easier when you're a D2C first business, right? But as you open up more channels from a distribution perspective and that your customers are in many more places, what is the consequence of that? And is that something that goes into your decision on which channels you expand into? And another question linked to that is also, what is the customer strategy element in terms of thinking about opening new distribution channels?
It's such a good question. Obviously, I think DTC e-com and owned retail are still kind of two channels that you can fully own as a brand. And I will always really kind of advocate for a multi-channel experience because I believe it's not about what we want, it's about what the customer wants. So if they want to discover you on Nordstrom and try on shoes in person and then convert online, like let them do it. Make it easy for them. Or if it's opposite, they want to try it on in your store and buy on Nordstrom. My philosophy, which someone could totally disagree with, is just we should not have a perspective on how we want customers to shop. We should be where they want to be and support them and make it really easy to move across all channels. They're just going to do what they want to do, so we may as well make it easy.
I feel the same way, but I also feel like a lot of retail leaders tell me that their teams struggle with that concept and pushing the customers to buy online when they're in the store.
Well, this is where it all comes back to like my real love is like organizational design and how you're setting up incentives across a business. So that's a whole additional podcast. I'm lucky at Margaux in that we are setting this up from scratch. And I think there's several of us, including our new VP of Retail and Wholesale. She and I have lived this before. And so we're trying to bring some of the learnings we've had in the past. And the co-founders are very much aligned with let's make it an omni-channel first culture and not have it be about, did you make the sale? Did you make the sale? And there are tactical things that we're going to have to figure out. So when you have a more omni-channel P&L, which is something I was really involved with at Ref, you have to decide where to put an expense and where to book the revenue. And for things like ship from store or pick up in store or ship to store, or we had kind of some clienteling level programs that crossed e-com and retail in a way that was exactly meeting the customer where they needed to be. But you do have to, just from an accounting perspective, account for it correctly. Then you have to plan for labor at a store correctly. You have to have an overall P&L that makes sense. So I definitely don't want to minimize the logistical side of getting all of that right. It's a lot. But I still do think culturally there can be an us versus them mentality that develops in a retail versus omni-channel or versus e-com business, especially one that started as e-com first. And the crucial thing is building from the beginning and understanding that the two channels are the same business, same team. We should support each other equally. And I guess that's like a little Pollyanna sounding. And maybe I'll come back to you in 5 years and let you know how it's going at Margaux, but I really believe that you can do it as long as you set it up from the beginning. And again, I come back to like, as long as the founders or the CEO is really beating that drumbeat with the organization, that's how we should operate.
Well, that's always leadership driven. And at the end of the day, a lot of times it's treated as two separate organizations. A lot of times the stores are the whole organizations. They have their sales meetings. They have all of that. They know each other, but they don't know anybody that is in HQ. And
Right.
so ultimately it cannot work as an omnichannel organization if it's not just one organization. And then to your point, having the right incentives, having the right understanding and the right training to fully understand the customer and that omnichannel reality of the customer.
100%. And I think the second piece of that is wholesale. So when you think about retail and e-com, and wholesale is an interesting, really evolving space. So we've recently launched with Nordstrom on their marketplace platform. We launched in about February, and the customer response has been overwhelming in the best way. So we're having an extraordinary partnership with Nordstrom, and we're excited to open up another retailer soon. I think the marketplace side of things at Stitch Fix, it was like the early days of it, and we talked a lot about it, but I didn't experience the coming to fruition while I was there. And now being on the brand side, I think what Nordstrom has done is really like ahead of the pack, and we're excited to onboard with the second retailer and experience it with them too. But it really does feel like an evolution for both sides, where Nordstrom can get visibility without having to take on full inventory risk, and kind of likewise for us, like we get to see and understand like where we have the most customer resonance, but it gives us a lot more visibility than a traditional wholesale relationship does, depending on the structure. of knowing exactly what's selling, when is selling, because the marketplaces are kind of plugged into our Shopify platform. So there is just a coming back to the data side, whereas I'm dying to know who our Nordstrom customer is, and I know nothing about her because that the customer data part is ring fenced. But I can get a sense for who she is by what she's buying. And I think we're super excited to continue assorting for that customer and building out that experience for her and having that be a place of real brand discovery. But also we're okay if they discover Margaux on Nordstrom and only ever buy it from Nordstrom because that's their retailer of choice. Like, great. The more traditional wholesale relationship is a bit more complicated because you just don't have as much visibility into the customer experience. But that's where, when you start thinking about in-store wholesale, what I think is for shoes really valuable as an example, it's just about treating it like retail. And that's why for our really senior retail hire, she's the VP of retail and wholesale. And I think that for wholesale to be successful, especially from an in-store buy perspective, is giving those teams the shoes, giving them as much product knowledge and experience as possible, like treating them like they are also team members. And it just kind of feels like it's the same philosophy that just has some different scaffolding around it because it's a separate company. But it feels like the more you can make it feel connected and bring everyone along the brand story, the better.
Would you say that for you, wholesale is more of a customer acquisition channel, a place for people to discover the brand, create that brand awareness, but yet outside of your brand ecosystem?
I certainly think the customer acquisition is a big piece of it, but I don't think it is just a customer acquisition tool. It depends on maybe how you nest discovery under acquisition. But Nordstrom and Bloomingdale's are two outstanding retailers that have really, ever since I was a kid, have been bringing brands to the forefront of customers' journeys. And so I think if someone can discover Margaux in a wholesale capacity, whether we acquire them there or on our site, whether they shop again on our site or there, if we're creating brand loyalists, it doesn't really matter where they shop. But I do think like an in-person discovery specifically, which is kind of the dream, we won't be able to scale the same way with our owned retail as we would be able to with an in-store buy from one of these bigger retailers.
Nor should you.
Yeah.
Something that has come up a lot with marketplaces is the conversation around, is there an audience overlap? And I think it's very interesting because you're the first person who brings up to me, you know what, if there is an audience overlap and if there is, paraphrasing and tell me if that's not how you feel, but it seems that ultimately you want them to shop wherever they would want to shop, regardless of whether they're both shopping with Margaux and with Nordstrom. If they have a preference for shopping at Nordstrom this quarter because it's more efficient for them and because it fits within their lifestyle better, then that's the right approach. Is that right for you?
I mean, that's how I feel. I think that could be very heavily debated if that's the right approach or not. I think the reason why I feel that way is because, so look, your DTC margin is almost always going to be better, right, than a wholesale margin. But there's the element of the customer experience where, let's say that, I'm trying to think of the three examples here. One is that they're already a Margaux customer and they shop on Nordstrom. Maybe that's the worst case scenario, but even then it's kind of like if that's the easier place for them to go, it doesn't bother me. Then there's they haven't discovered the brand and they discover it on Nordstrom, which is obviously a great outcome. And then they either keep shopping on Nordstrom because, to your point, it's the right fit for their lifestyle and how they shop, or it prompts them to check us out separately. And then they convert and become DTC customers. And I kind of think anywhere along that whole spectrum, it doesn't bother me.
I think you're being very much a realist, which I like, because there's been really a lot of debate in terms of, that customer data ring fence and whether marketplaces should be also giving you that data and at the end of the day, enable you to fully acquire that customer beyond discovery. And I guess this is something where there hasn't really been technical solution found to try to anyway power a commercial agreement on that. But I think that's probably where we'll see a lot of innovation, because especially in the luxury space with large luxury groups, there's such a desire to own that customer data, to own that customer. I'm very interested to see where this will go.
I do think if that as the next frontier would be so exciting, and figuring out what type of partnership would, and to your point, tech solution needs to be in place to enable that. I kind of believe that in that situation, and maybe it depends on the size and stage of the brand, but that the kind of like rising tide lifts all ships. Yeah, that it could be net positive for everyone. But I also completely understand and see the importance of also like owning your own customer data on both sides of the fence and having that be like a big part of the value prop. So I see it both ways. I'd love to have their email addresses and opt-ins, but right now, yeah, it's not part of the experience.
Before we wrap up, I think this has been just such a fun conversation. Is there anything that you think is a really, really exciting opportunity within retail that excites you and that people should think about? And on the flip side, do you think there are really common missteps or myths that people should be worried about or just generally keep an eye on?
I think what I'm most excited about, and I hope this doesn't come off as like a SF tech person because it's really actually not at all who I am. What I'm excited about for Margaux is that it feels like we can scale up our team and continue to hire and retain a just incredible team of people. Layer on AI driven tools that allow us to do our jobs more efficiently in a way that will allow us to scale faster that then bigger companies will be able to scale down. And so where being nimble has always been a value prop, but I think that being a small company that works really well together and is tech driven, or at least is tech curious, feels like such an advantage at this moment. So I'm really excited from that perspective for Margaux and where we are in our journey. And being able to be very quick on implementing and testing tools is a big advantage. I think similarly, I'm just incredibly curious how AI search is going to just blow up our industry, right? The same way that Facebook ads and Google search have just completely redefined how we market directly to customers. It just feels like we're on a precipice here. And I've had conversations this week about it where I'm especially thinking about that. But I like the idea of having a tool that's smarter and is actually pulling in a bunch of information to personalize and recommend the best product for different people. I'm so excited to see how it will evolve, how people discover, because that is like the nut that no single retailer or company has cracked, right? How do you match the perfect product with exactly the right person and what they're looking for? And I think we're going to get there. So I just want to be part of it.
It's also being in a monobrand retailer, it is less of a threat than being in a multi-brand retailer. It is more of an opportunity. And I think the question is, how do we optimize to make sure we're discoverable by the AI the same way that we would be discoverable by the customer, right? So it's not just only about catering to the customer, but it's also catering for all the AI systems in order for that product to customer match to be as easy as possible.
Yes, but what I will say is like on my very nascent understanding so far is that those two are closer together than they've ever been. Yeah. Meaning forums like Reddit and places where customers are really engaging with each other back and forth on something are being more heavily weighted by AI. So if you do right by the customer and create the community and create the connection, it feels like, I don't know this for a fact yet because I'm not deep enough into it yet, but that it's less about like SEO gaming and it's more about like actually fostering conversation and customer relationships. So if that ends up being true, I think that's going to be pretty cool because it's going to be kind of win-win.
Fostering content generation, if it is customer created content, even better.
Yeah, totally.
So the objectives are merging. So interesting. Well, it's been such a pleasure, Emily. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. So fun.